So, what makes a game enterprise successful? The prevailing theory is that the game's realism contributes in a necessary way to its success. However, this can mean one of two things. Either a developer can focus on the game's graphics and other sensory interfaces relevant to the performance of the game's successful completion of that game's various tasks, or the developer can focus on kinesthetic interfaces. At issue is the question of how much of the developer can focus, how much of the player is involved in manipulating the various artifacts of the game's world. John Cockburn and Mark Silcox defend the latter, while the prevailing view focuses on the former. Their defense is rooted in a distinction between phenomenalism and enactivism, arguing that recent advances in game development give us reason to think the prevailing phenomenalist views of realism and to reject the prevailing phenomenalist views of realism and to adopt enactivism. In this segment, I will suggest that Star Citizen represents an even more recent game development that should cause us to further evaluate Cockburn et al. So the problem with extant phenomenalist views is the question of what counts for realism in video games. What is perception? So in order to look at this question, we can look at some other ones. For instance, what is perceptual realism and what counts as perceptual realism? So Cockburn and Silcox quote, "In this chapter, we will argue that very few people predicted the success of the Wii, Nintendo Wii, that is, because nearly everybody's view of the human-computer interface presupposed the truth of phenomenalism. According to this philosophical theory, people do not directly perceive the actual world, but instead experience a realm that is a function of their own private sensory manifolds." So let's imagine that you're out for a walk on a sunny day and you can feel the sun shining down on your skin. You see a rock before you, you bend down and you pick it up and you feel the texture of the rock, you feel the surface, and it's rough, and you also feel the temperature of the rock. Maybe it's been baking in the sun all day, and so it's a little bit warm to the touch. Now, so if phenomenalists are correct, you're not perceiving the rock directly. So what do we mean by perceiving the rock directly? Well, when you think about what the rock is, it's one single object, right? And so what you have in your hand is that object. But the problem is what you're actually perceiving. You're perceiving the temperature of the rock, you're perceiving the texture of the surface, you're perceiving the weight of the rock, perhaps the color, so on and so forth. But you're not perceiving the rock in all of its many attributes, right? You're just perceiving each individual attribute separately, and then your brain puts those attributes together and gives you the image of the rock. So phenomenalism is an argument against direct perception of the world around us. Namely, according to it, we do not see or perceive the world, but just an image, a phenomenal image, mind you, but an image all the same of the world, and we create this image from a collection of sense data. It's the colors, the touch, it's the texture, it's the weight, it's the density. So instead, Cockburn et al., so this is the alternative view, Cockburn et al., defend enactivism. And according to enactivists, direct perception is a function of the way we manipulate ourselves in our environment. So our direct perception is manifest in our manipulation of the rock. So we pick it up, we're holding it, we turn it around, and we're enacting with it, we're acting it. Now, how this relates to game development is that, so when we think about what game development is, and there are two kinds of goals that a game developer might have. Well, ultimately there's the goal of making money, but let's assume that game developers are artists. And I think that's probably the correct way to view a game developer. Maybe the backers, they're the finance people, but the developer themselves, they're artists, right? And so there are two goals that they could possibly have. One is possibly to recreate life in all of its complexity and its uniqueness to perfectly. And so the question is, how do they do that? One is by prioritizing the kinesthetics, right? So when we look at the success of the Nintendo Wii, what Cogburn and Silcox are arguing is that the reason why the Wii outsold the other game systems, namely PlayStation, I think it was 3 at the time, or the Xbox 360, is because instead of focusing on the graphics, Nintendo focused on the player's ability to manipulate the game world, right? And so it outsold the console, even though those consoles had superior graphics. And so what Cogburn and Silcox argue is that this expresses an important distinction in game aesthetics, one between two competing versions of realism. So phenomenalism, once again, is a version of realism, is understanding what counts as realism, and according to it, people do not directly perceive the actual world, but instead experience a realm that is a function of their own private sensory manifolds. And so what that means is that we collect all the sense data, and we have different faculties for collecting that sense data, whether it's the nerves in our fingertips, or whether it's the rods in our eyeballs, or it's the silicum, whatever, in our nose. It's the filaments in our ear, right? And so these are all just different faculties for collecting sense data, whether it be sound, whether it be texture, color, density, shape. You have it, right? And then enactivists, they're going to say, well, direct perception is really just a function of how we physically manipulate ourselves in our environments. So what I am going to argue is that it's not a function of how we necessarily physically manipulate ourselves in our environments, but it could be a way all the same of how we manipulate ourselves and our environments, whether it's physical or not. So now, to the extent that game developers want to simulate life as much as possible, there are two different avenues of pursuit available to them, and therefore there are two possible weighted values with respect to game development. One is advanced graphical capacities, photorealism, and so according to Cogburn and Silcox, if the phenomenalists are correct, then that would be enough to create a good selling product. And then the other option that is available to them is the advanced kinesthetics, the sensory motor, to focus on the sensory motor applications of a device, or the sensory motor manipulation of the device. So enactivists accordingly then will pursue the second avenue, and the reason why Cogburn and Silcox argue this is the case, and what they're going to say is because we directly perceive the world as a function of the way we manipulate, and the way they understand that, and so I just repeated it, I'm not going to repeat it again, but the way they understand that is, one, by reimagining visualization, and so instead of visualization just merely being a manifestation of like some kind of graphical capacity, it's going to be something else entirely. Also, muscle memory. Muscle memory is important for how we manipulate our environment, and of course we can do the same thing over and over again with our hands, with our feet, or whatever it is, but that's important, and the reason why is because our muscles remember experiences. And so what they're going to say is that like the movement of our muscles are going to be another way to collect and engage in our environments. And then they use an example of a study done using light reversing eyeglasses, and we'll explain more of that later on. But so let's look at some of the earlier phenomenalist views, especially one by a philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell. You probably heard of him. He's a fairly famous philosopher, but he wrote a book called Problems of Philosophy, and so this is what Cogburn and Silcox are going to call the Russellian heritage, and this is part one of Russell's argument in favor of phenomenalism. So this is Russell, and I'm quoting, by the way. So he says, "To the eye it is oblong, brown and shining. To the touch it is smooth and cool and hard. When I tap it, it gives out a wooden sound. Anyone else who sees and feels and hears the table will agree with this description so that it might seem that no difficulty would arise. So when viewing an object, we only perceive various properties according to the faculty with the requisite capacity, right? So we can't hear smells, we can't taste sounds, so on and so forth. And so whatever property that we're perceiving, it's only a perception by one's faculty of sense, one sense faculty. So we see color and shape, we feel texture, and we necessarily feel texture. We can't hear texture. And we hear the sound something makes when we wrap our hands against it or smell the odor that it gives off. As such, we only directly perceive that particular sense data with a given faculty. And so we're not perceiving the actual argument. We're perceiving properties of the object, right? And so things that are immediately known to the senses, and these are going to be color, sound, smells, hardness, and roughness, but they're only known directly to a given sense. And so if we think, why should a game developer focus on photorealism, it's important to note that we might suspect that the question above is incomplete. Why should game developers focus only on photorealism, right? But we'll kind of explore that question a little bit further on. But first, let's look at Russell's argument a little bit more closely. So we begin with a short overview of some of the arguments for sense data. But what does an argument for sense data look like, and what does it defend? So here's Russell once again, page 2 of the book. So as soon as we try to be more precise, our troubles begin. Although I believe that the table is really of the same color all over, the parts that reflect the light look much brighter than the other parts, and some parts look white because of reflected light. I know that if I move, the parts that reflect the light will be different, so that the apparent distribution of colors on the table will change. It follows that if several people are looking at the table at the same moment, no two of them will see exactly the same distribution of colors, because no two can see it from exactly the same point of view. And any change in the point of view makes some change in the way the light is reflected. So let's imagine we're standing in a room and it's maybe early afternoon, maybe a little bit earlier than that early afternoon. It's winter time, so the sun's going to go down a little bit earlier, and the room we're in is like an old Oxford room. Let's imagine we're in an office on the Oxford's campus, I don't know, in one of the colleges there or something, and we've got the afternoon light streaming in through one of the few windows of our office, right? And we've got like those big heavy curtains hung up, and it's kind of filtering the light a little bit. But essentially what's happening is that the light from the sun that's streaming in through our window, or the winter sun that's streaming in through our window, is going to be reflecting off this big dark walnut table in front of us. So let's imagine a dark walnut type table, maybe something that was handmade a long time ago, and it's heavy and it's made with real wood, and it's got a really nice gloss and shine on it because they work really hard to keep the finish of the wood and keep the varnish up to keep the varnish looking good and things like that. And so the sun's shining in through the window and it's reflecting off the table, and when we look at it, and let's imagine we're standing in like the northwest corner of the room or something like that, and we look at the table and it looks almost white because the light's shining so brightly on it. But if we move to the other side of the room, let's say where the sun is almost shining directly in our faces, and we look at the table again, now it's going to look a lot darker. It's going to look probably closer to the color that we attribute to it, which is that dark brown walnut, almost reddish type color. And so wherever we move around the room, the table does appear to change colors. And so what Russell is arguing here is that although there are different sensory modalities through which we can experience an object, the way we experience the object through these sensory modalities, it still further changes. And so let's imagine that I'm hearing the sound of someone's voice, but I've got water in my ear. It's going to sound differently as the sound of the voice travels through the water. Let's imagine that the person is far away. Their voice is going to sound differently than if they're right up close. And so like so we have objects that we experience, but we only experience the properties, and even the properties seem to change depending on like our point in space from where we're perceiving it, or maybe time. A young person can hear sounds much more acutely than like an older person, and so on and so forth. So consider Russell's or anyone's belief, for that matter, that a given object is a given color, but imagine that to their surprise, when they move positions, they step away from the direct light of the sun to a more shady corner, the table appears to be a different color as well. So Russell's problems of philosophy argument. So here's the argument. Let's boil it down and make it nice and clean and simple. We've got three premises. Properties that are perceived by us change with our positions and techniques of observation. Premise 2, but real properties of objects are stable. They don't move, right? Brown is always going to be brown, and so if a table is brown, it's always going to be brown, at least we would think. Therefore, the properties of objects that we perceive are not the real properties of the objects that exist. And this would explain why tables change shape and they change color, maybe with time, but also with like our point of how we're perceiving them and so on. So there are two kinds of properties then: properties of perception, and then there are real properties. And so if we look at a given table and it has a particular color, and we can measure that color, say with a spectrometer or some kind of other device that's going to maybe give us the hex color of that table or something like that, the hex code, well then we might think that that's a real property of that object. But then there are the properties of perception, and these are the ones that change according to our point of reference. But that's not the only argument that Russell gives. He also gives another argument. So, this other argument, he's going to say we would call it the argument from different minds. At least Carver and Silcox calls it the argument from different minds. And so what they say is, other creatures perceive the world differently from us. So imagine the way a bat perceives its world. And there's a very famous book by Thomas Nagel called The View from Nowhere. In it, he gives an example it gives one of the chapters, or maybe this is a standalone paper. It's called What's It Like to Be a Bat? But imagine if you're a bat and the way you get around is by echolocation. Well, your perception of the world is much different from you or I. So other creatures perceive the world differently from us. Therefore, it is, and this is premise 2, therefore it is possible that neither us or those other creatures are perceiving the actual world, but only the world of perception, right? And so, the bat, as it flies around, and it's echolocating, the point space of these various insects. It's not insects that it's perceiving, but it's really these various properties that it's perceiving. And so therefore we only perceive sense data rather than the real properties of the object. So maybe there are objects there, we just don't have direct access to them. And so maybe we could say we have to use science to really understand the material makeup of a table or an insect. And we do this all the time. So we're constantly using various tools and methods to try and determine what the real property of nature is, what the real material of nature is, right? And so you've got string theories and different views rooted in physics. Anyway. So perception and feedback seem to be synonymous. Therefore, viewing entities on a monitor, and so this is where we're bringing in the question about what this has to do with video game development. And so, in this part of the paper, Cogburn and Silcox call it phenomenalism, and the paper is homunculus, homunculus. I cannot pronounce that word, I'm sorry. I'll put it on the screen for you. But anyway, perception and feedback seem to be synonymous, right? And so it doesn't matter how we like whether we're perceiving objects, the real objects themselves, or just sense data. It's the sense data that we respond to. Therefore, viewing entities on a monitor is no different than viewing them in real life. So just when I see an entity, when I'm playing a video game or watching a show or something like that, conceptually there's no difference between that visual sense data that I'm receiving from the computer monitor versus the visual sense data that I'm receiving from, say, a rock or something like that. Therefore, improving the sense data will correlate with attributions of realism. So if we improve the sense data that's coming from the monitor, then it's going to correlate with realism. Like, it's going to seem more real. It's going to be more real even. So the more real something appears, the more real it is. Therefore, Cogburn and Silcox point out that according to phenomenalism, game designers ought to work to improve a game system's sensory interface. However, it is still they're going to argue that it is still a mistake to say that an image presented through a game's visual interface looks better than another because it looks like the real world. And so we're going to stop it right there, and probably I'll in the next video, and I'll try to do this one really fast, I will finish the rest of this paper. 20 minutes, that's pretty long, I think, but so if you've stayed with me this long, I appreciate it, and sorry I'm not getting to the end of this argument. To be honest, with this topic here, I wanted to do really well with it, just because it's a really interesting topic. It involves questions about what makes a good game, and it has to do with the way human beings perceive the world, whether they perceive it as a manifestation, as an object to be manipulated, or whether they perceive it as a grouping of various properties. Anyway, so if you like this video, let me know. Give me some encouragement. Just put some comments in the if you have any advice on how I can make it better, I'd love to hear it. Just leave some comments. Ultimately, eventually, what I'm going to start doing is making. I'm going to have short form videos, which are the ones going to be on YouTube, but then I'll have longer ones for platforms like Spotify and things like that. Anyway, I don't want to keep this one too long. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next time.